Hi, I'm Kathy from The Girl Who Goes, and about a year ago in summer 2025, I was diagnosed with celiac disease. Kind of felt like bad timing because I was getting ready to go on my honeymoon to 3 countries in Asia, and I had had this trip planned for almost a year. But I ended up going to Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan as a gluten-free traveler, and it was not easy. But if you're planning your own trip to Taiwan, I'm gonna help you find out everything you need to know to plan your own trip with confidence. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. These are only my experiences and I'm not highly symptomatic, though I always do my best to avoid cross contact. So be sure to double check everything, ask your own questions, and only eat what you feel comfortable eating. One of the things that I was really looking forward to before our trip to Asia was all of the different foods that we don't have in the US. Taiwan is famous for its street food, night markets, bubble tea, all that good stuff. And I did as much research as I could in advance to find out whether those would even be options for me. I was scouring Facebook groups, I was reading blog posts, I was trying to build my own maps, doing everything that I could to try and give myself the best chance of having an okay time when it comes to food in Taiwan. But even with all of that preparation, I still struggled. We had been in Japan before we went to Taiwan on this trip, and Japan was a little bit easier because there are a lot of people who have been to Japan, a lot of gluten-free and celiac travelers who have been to Japan, so I was able to lean on their advice before I went. So I would say that Japan was maybe a 6.5 out of 10 on the difficulty scale, but I wasn't prepared for how tough Taiwan was going to be. I would say that it was probably a 9 out of 10 on the difficulty scale, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that not as many people have been to Taiwan, so there's just not as much information out there. So my goal was to struggle through it and come out with as much information that I could share on the other side to make it easier for everyone else who's going. So one thing that really surprised me when we first got to Taiwan and made me really excited was that I started noticing that food labels in Taiwan actually list gluten as an allergen. For those of us in the US, we know that that is not the case in the US, and I'm lucky enough to live in Spain where gluten is a required allergen on packaging here, and it's actually very, very strict and it's very trustworthy. So the first few days when we were in Taiwan, I thought, oh, if it doesn't list gluten as an allergen on the label, then I'm safe to eat this. But after a few days, despite not being highly symptomatic, I started noticing that my body wasn't feeling really good. And eventually we ended up at one of the best gluten-free restaurants in Taipei, in Chai, and we started talking to the owner, Rajat, who is actually celiac. I started asking him a ton of questions. He was super nice, super willing to help and answer any questions that I had. And he told me that despite gluten being labeled on packaging in Taiwan, you cannot trust it. It doesn't account for any cross-contamination that may be occurring in these factories, and it's just not highly regulated. So I had been kind of operating under false pretenses that anything that didn't have gluten in it on the label was considered gluten-free, but that's just unfortunately not the case. I started asking Rajat about what snacks or convenience store food that I might be able to find that could be safe, and he said there really isn't anything. So he was like, yeah, I live here, I'm celiac, and it's extremely difficult, but it's hard to trust anything. And that unfortunately, and kind of fortunately, changed my whole perspective on food in Taiwan the rest of the time I was there. Instead, I focused on going to restaurants that said that they could handle gluten-free and had reviews from other travelers. So now let's get into some of those best restaurants in Taipei for gluten-free travelers. Restaurants with gluten-free options in Taipei. We spent a week in Taiwan, but we pretty much stayed in Taipei the entire time except for a couple little quick day trips. So here are the restaurants that I ate at or that I could recommend for celiac travelers visiting Taipei. In Chai. This was my favorite dedicated gluten-free restaurant in Taipei. Everything there is completely gluten-free, so you don't have to worry about cross-contamination. And the owners, Stella and Rajat, don't even allow gluten to be brought into the restaurant. They took the time to tell us where we could find other restaurants with gluten-free options in Taipei, and international grocery stores that were more likely to have imported gluten-free food. Also, the food at Indus Chai was delicious. Plants is another 100% dedicated gluten-free restaurant in Taipei that's vegan as well. So if you're looking for a safe option, you know you can depend on Plants. Orchid Indian Restaurant. This is not a dedicated gluten-free restaurant, but they seem to have a pretty good handle on gluten-free, and I felt safe eating there. When we showed them our translation card, they actually knew what it meant and they started speaking in English to us. So if you go there, you shouldn't have too hard of a time communicating your needs. Addiction Aquatic Development. This is a fish market and it's actually really fun to walk around and see all of the fish, but if you're looking for a good meal there, I recommend getting some of the prepackaged sashimi and bringing your own gluten-free soy sauce, which you can find in some grocery stores, and just having a little to-go picnic with your sashimi and your soy sauce. La Piola Cucina Italiana. We trekked all the way here across town to go here because it was one of Rajat's recommendations and it had really good reviews on Find Me GF. But unfortunately, after we got there, there was a handwritten sign on the door saying they were on vacation. So unfortunately, we didn't get to eat here. I would have really liked to, but that should be another great option. I think they're Italian and you know Italians understand celiac, so I would definitely trust them. Heidi Lau. So a lot of people online said that you can do hot pot pretty easily if you're celiac. And again, I wasn't 100% sure how true this really would be. And I don't know Chinese, so I have a hard time wanting to ask a ton of questions sometimes. But basically, Heidi Lau is a chain hot pot restaurant. And we found that it was somewhat safe if we ordered hot water as our base, because you can choose whatever broth you want. We ordered hot water and you basically just order meat and vegetables and you just kind of boil them in the water. I added, again, gluten-free soy sauce into my hot water so that it actually had flavor, but I had to sneak that in and I just tried to make sure that nobody saw me adding it to the water. If you go with other people, you can divide your soup pot into multiple flavors. So Matt actually got like a spicy broth for his soup base and I just got hot water. I think that we did a good job keeping them separate, but I would recommend that your whole group just does hot water, or you have to be super careful that the water doesn't splash back and forth between the two sides. Sometimes the waiters will come around and add extra broth to one side or another. So don't let them do that because they probably aren't going to know that you're trying so hard to keep both sides separate. So you really have to be super vigilant if you're going to do this, but I felt happy that I had the opportunity to do a real hot pot experience, and Heidi Lau is like kind of a cool vibe. So make sure you make a reservation though, because we tried to go one night when the Italian pizza place was closed and it was a 3-hour wait. And yes, they are open until like 3 or 4 a.m., but we didn't want to stay out that late. So make your reservation online and I think it's a good option. Shrimp fishing. So one last unconventional recommendation is to go shrimp fishing, which is a common pastime in Taiwan. And I know it sounds kind of crazy, but hear me out. We went shrimp fishing and after we caught our shrimp, the boss, I don't know if that's what he's really called, but that's how everybody referred to him in the Google reviews and that got translated into English. So I'm gonna call him the boss. After we caught our shrimp, the boss asked if we wanted to cook the shrimp and have them for dinner. I thought that there was a good chance that this was going to be gluten-free, but I wasn't 100% sure, so I pulled up my Google Translate on my phone and I wrote, "Are there any seasoning on these shrimps?" Because I found out that gluten isn't super well understood in Asia, but if I kind of framed it as like, hey, I have some allergies, so I need you to tell me exactly what's in this, that worked a lot better. So I said, "Are there any seasonings on the shrimp?" And he said, "Just salt." So that's how I knew that this shrimp was going to be safe for me to eat. And actually that was some of the most protein I got to eat in the entire time we were in Taiwan. So if you are feeling like you're underfed, because that's how I felt a lot of the time in Taiwan, go shrimp fishing, have some shrimp for dinner, and you'll start to feel better and you'll get to have a really cool, unique Taiwan experience at the same time. So as I mentioned, Taiwan is really famous for their night markets. And you might be wondering, is there anything I can eat at the Taiwan night markets? I had a hard time finding the answer to this question. There's a lot of conflicting information in those very few and sparse Facebook groups and blog posts out there. I actually came away feeling that there were a few things I could have at the night markets that might be safe for me. So when I got there, I tried things like the sweet potato balls and like bubble tea, but unfortunately I came to the conclusion that those are not safe, especially after talking to Rajat and finding out that my body was not happy with the things I had been eating. Yes, things like sweet potato balls may be technically gluten-free, but a lot of times the workers don't necessarily know what is mixed into the flour. You don't know what that oil has been used for. And the allergens just aren't super clear on these items, and so unfortunately I think the best option is to play it safe. So if you really want to have something at the night markets, the only things I can really recommend are some of the like 100% fruit smoothies, such as papaya smoothies or like watermelon smoothies. Again, when I would go to these stalls, I would say, can you tell me exactly what's in this? I have some allergies, so I need to know the ingredients. And usually that worked pretty well for me, to the point that the workers would even ask me if it was okay if they put ice in it, as if I were going to be allergic to ice. But you know what? They started double checking everything, which made me feel more safe, and I was still pretty happy to walk around the night markets with my smoothie and just kind of take in all the sights and smells that way. Where to buy gluten-free food in Taiwan. Anytime we saw a grocery store, we would generally pop in just to see what we could find. We found Carrefour, which is a brand we're familiar with from living in Spain. And Carrefour here has a gluten-free section, so we were hoping that would be the case in Taiwan, but that was not the case. Most grocery stores didn't have much besides potentially gluten-free soy sauce, but be sure to double check that it is actually gluten-free. Convenience stores didn't have a lot of great options. The only things I was able to consistently find, which is what I pretty much lived off for the entire week we were in Taiwan, were popcorners, soy joy bars, and fruit. Thankfully, there was a lot of prepackaged fruit, so I pretty much just ate fruit for a week in Taiwan. Rajat did tell us about some of the larger international grocery stores, like Breeze Super, which was in the bottom of a mall, but I was only able to find a few things that were labeled gluten-free, including Flamin' Hot Cheetos from the US. So not the most nutritious, but again, it was just another snack that at least made me feel like I was eating something. I loved visiting Taiwan, and the people there I think were the nicest that I've ever met in the entire world. But it was a really hard place to visit, especially as a new celiac and new gluten-free traveler. With that being said, here are my top 3 tips for anyone who is gluten-free visiting Taiwan. My first tip is to trust nothing. All of the food in Taiwan looks delicious and smells delicious, but you pretty much have to assume that everything has gluten until proven otherwise. It doesn't matter that gluten is considered an allergen on food labeling. It doesn't necessarily mean it's free from cross-contamination, which means that you really shouldn't be eating it. I was cautiously optimistic my first few days in Taiwan eating anything that I thought was safe, but after a few days, my body told me that this was not the case, so I really had to scale back on what I was eating, and my body was hungry, but at least it didn't feel like it got glutened. My second tip is to bring gluten-free snacks from home. We try to pack pretty light most of the time, so we were traveling only with a carry-on backpack and a personal item backpack, but I really wish that I had stocked up even more on gluten-free snacks before we left for our trip. We had been in Japan right before Taiwan, and they did actually have a few gluten-free ramen noodle cups. So I took a couple of those with me to Taiwan, but I wish I had brought like 10 because like I said, I was hungry a lot of the time. And so if you have the opportunity to stock up on gluten-free food before your trip to Taiwan, I highly recommend it. My third tip is to not rely too much on the gluten-free translation cards. I've had mixed experiences with the gluten-free translation cards so far in my year of being celiac, but I felt that they didn't help a ton in Taiwan because, again, gluten is just not an understood concept. I kind of think about it like if I were working in a restaurant in the US and somebody from another culture came in and said, I'm allergic to emulsifiers. Can you tell me if there's any emulsifiers in my food? I would probably just be like, I don't know what that means, but yeah, I think it's safe. You just have to assume that they have no idea what gluten is, and so they cannot tell you one way or another if something contains gluten. What I mentioned before, which was asking them to tell me exactly what seasonings were in something, that worked a lot better because that put kind of the burden of proof on them to tell me what was in it. So that's when I would just say, I have some allergens, can you tell me the ingredients? And then it was up to me to decide whether those ingredients would likely contain gluten or not. So I know what spices are likely to contain gluten. I know what other ingredients are likely to contain gluten. They don't, but if they tell me those ingredients, I can make that decision for myself. Despite Taiwan being a pretty tough place for a new celiac traveler, I still really loved the country. The people were so friendly, the scenery was beautiful, the temples were so intricate, and I really felt like I was in another world. So if you're a celiac or gluten-free traveler, it does take a little extra preparation, or maybe a lot of extra preparation, but it's definitely worth it. So I hope that you found the information here to be helpful. If you want an even more deep dive, as well as a map that I put together of safe restaurants in Taiwan, and my sad Pinterest board about convenience store snacks you can find in Taiwan, go check out my blog post, which is linked in the description below. If you happen to be traveling to Japan or South Korea on your trip as well, I also have videos about how to be a gluten-free or celiac traveler in those locations, so you will also find that linked in the description below. I hope you found this helpful, and don't forget to check out my blog for more travel guides and other gluten-free travel tips. And if you're going to Taiwan and you still have questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.